Normandy, June 1944. The sky churned with cordite smoke and aluminum rain, pieces of aircraft falling like autumn leaves through clouds stained black by burning fuel. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson pulled back on the stick of his P-47 Thunderbolt, feeling the massive radial engine shudder beneath him, watching tracer fire arc past his canopy like angry meteors. His tail section hung by cables and prayers. The fabric covering was shredded, exposing skeletal framework that caught the wind and screamed. 8 Focke-Wulf Fw-190s circled him like sharks sensing blood, their yellow noses bright against the steel-gray overcast, pilots radioing each other in disbelief that this crippled American fighter still flew, still fought, still killed. He had been told the P-47 was a flying tank. He was about to prove it was something more. Spring 1943. Republic Aviation's factory floor in Farmingdale, Long Island stretched under harsh fluorescent lights, the air thick with metal shavings and welding smoke. Workers assembled the P-47 Thunderbolt piece by massive piece, riveting together what critics called the milk jug, or the flying bathtub. At 7 tons empty, nearly 4 tons heavier than the nimble P-51 Mustang, the Thunderbolt looked like it belonged on a runway, not dancing through combat at 25,000 feet. Engineers had built the aircraft around a single concept: bring the pilot home. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, producing 2,000 horsepower, sat encased in steel cowling thick enough to stop rifle rounds. Behind it, armor plating surrounded the pilot's seat like a medieval knight's backplate. Beneath the wings, 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns waited, 4 per side, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. The German pilots called it der Jug, the Jug. They meant it as mockery. The name would come to mean something else entirely. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson arrived at the 61st Fighter Squadron in early 1943, fresh from training, 22 years old, with hands that still remembered Oklahoma farmland and eyes that had never seen a man die. The squadron operated from Manston, a forward air base on England's southeastern coast, where salt wind mixed with aviation fuel, and the channel stretched gray and cold toward occupied France. His first briefing felt like drowning. Major Gerald Johnson, no relation, stood before a wall map dotted with red pins marking flak concentrations, each representing 80mm guns that could tear a fighter apart at 20,000 feet. The major's voice carried the flat certainty of experience. You'll fly bomber escort. You'll maintain formation. You'll engage only when the bombers are threatened. You will not, he emphasized this, break formation for individual glory. Robert nodded with the others. None of them understood yet what it meant to watch a B-17 explode, to see 9 men become vapor and twisted metal, to count empty bunks each evening. The P-47's cockpit smelled of hydraulic fluid and leather, cramped despite the aircraft's bulk. Robert learned its systems through repetition: fuel mixture, propeller pitch, supercharger settings, gun charging handles. The control column required muscle. No power-assisted controls here. Banking hard in combat meant wrestling 7 tons of fighter through turns that grayed vision and compressed organs. His first kill came in May 1943, over the French coast. So sudden he barely registered pulling the trigger. An Fw-190 crossed his sights during a melee, and the 8 50 calls converged their fire like concentrated thunder. The German fighter shed pieces, rolled inverted, and fell trailing black smoke. Robert's hands shook on the stick all the way back to England. He shot down his second on June 13th, his third 2 weeks later. Each engagement taught lessons written in adrenaline. The Fw-190 could outturn him, outclimb him in the initial stages, outroll him. But the P-47 could dive faster, take more punishment, and its 8 guns delivered firepower that could saw a fighter in half. German pilots learned to respect the Thunderbolt. Luftwaffe tactical reports from mid-1943 noted the American fighter's resilience, warning pilots that crippling hits didn't guarantee kills. One report documented a P-47 returning to base with 200 holes, half a wing shot away, and engine cylinders exposed. The pilot had landed safely, climbed out, and requested another aircraft. But nothing prepared either side for what would happen on June 26, 1944, when the impossible became documented fact. Dawn broke reluctant over Manston, pale light filtering through coastal fog that tasted of salt and burned rubber from the previous night's emergency landing. Robert S. Johnson stood in the briefing hut among 40 other pilots, coffee cooling in tin cups, cigarette smoke layering the air like stratus clouds. The wall map showed their route. Escort B-17s to a ball-bearing factory in Schweinfurt, deep in Germany where flak grew thick as thunderstorms and Luftwaffe squadrons waited in strength. The intelligence officer's pointer tapped the map. You'll face concentrated fighter opposition. JG-26 and JG-2 have been pulled from the Eastern Front. Expect Fw-190s in numbers. Robert checked his flight gear mechanically. Mae West life vest, parachute harness, gloves, throat microphone. His hands moved through ritual while his mind catalogued the weight of previous missions. He had 11 confirmed kills now, each one a moment of controlled chaos compressed into seconds. The lead computing, the trigger pressure, the shudder of 8 guns firing in unison, the sight of an enemy fighter tumbling earthward, trailing smoke and prayers in German. The crew chief met him at his P-47 number 26, marked with 13 mission symbols and a name painted on the nose. All hell. The name felt appropriate. The chief ran through the pre-flight. Oil pressure good, hydraulics charged, ammunition belts loaded, 432 rounds per gun, 3,456 rounds total, enough to fire for 34 seconds if he held the trigger down without cease. Robert climbed into the cockpit as ground crew pulled wheel chocks. The R-2800 coughed to life with a sound like contained thunder, 18 cylinders firing in sequence, the propeller arc becoming a transparent disc. The control tower's green light flashed. He released brakes and the 7-ton fighter rolled forward, tail coming up as airspeed built. The moment of transition when wheels left Earth and flight began, that instant of lightness before gravity remembered its claim. They formed up over the channel, 48 P-47s stacked in flights of 4, climbing through 10,000 feet where the air thinned and breath came harder despite the oxygen mask. Below, the English coast receded, its green patchwork fields giving way to gray water that stretched to a knife-edge horizon. Ahead, France waited, and beyond it Germany, and somewhere in that vast sky, pilots who wanted him dead. The bomber stream appeared at 25,000 feet, a formation of B-17 flying fortresses so large it seemed industrial rather than military, hundreds of 4-engine bombers arranged in combat boxes, their contrails drawing white lines across blue sky. Each carried 10 men and 6,000 pounds of high-explosive bombs. Each represented 10 families waiting for telegrams. Robert's squadron took position above and behind the bombers, weaving in lazy S-turns to match the B-17's slower speed. The radio crackled with call signs and positions. The sun climbed higher, glinting off perspex canopies and polished aluminum. For a moment, it felt almost peaceful. Then the first flak burst appeared, black flowers blooming at 24,000 feet, followed by dozens more, filling the sky with shrapnel that pinged against metal and tore through fabric and flesh with equal indifference. The call came through Robert's headset at 11:47 hours. Bandits 11 o'clock high, coming down. He looked left and up. 24 Fw-190s dropped from 28,000 feet, diving toward the bomber formation with the tactical precision that made the Luftwaffe legendary. Sunlight caught their yellow nose markings. The Abbeville Boys, JG-26's most experienced squadron, led by pilots who had killed dozens of Allied airmen. Robert's flight leader radioed, "Blue flight, engage, protect the heavies." The P-47s rolled into dives, gravity and 2,000 horsepower, accelerating 7 tons of fighter to speeds that made the airframe groan. Robert selected his target, an Fw-190 lining up on a B-17's vulnerable belly, and walked the rudder pedals to put the gun sight pipper on the German fighter's fuselage. His thumb found the trigger on the control stick. 8 50 caliber machine guns fired as one. The recoil shuddered through the aircraft. 1. Robert hauled back on the stick, pulling 4 Gs that compressed his vision to a tunnel. blood pooling in his legs despite the pressure suit. Another Fw-190 flashed across his sights. He fired a burst, too long, ammunition conservation forgotten in the chaos, and the German fighter's canopy shattered. It rolled inverted and dove away, trailing smoke. 2. The sky became a three-dimensional knife fight, aircraft turning inside each other's circles, angles measured in degrees and death in seconds. Robert's peripheral vision caught tracers everywhere, green from German guns, orange from American. A P-47 to his right took hits, canopy turning red, falling away in a flat spin. An Fw-190 exploded, victim of his wingman's accurate gunnery, pieces tumbling through the bomber formation like metal rain. He fired again, missed. The Fw-190 pulled up vertical, using its superior initial climb rate, a maneuver designed to force the heavier P-47 to overshoot. But Robert had learned. He pushed the nose down, used gravity and mass to convert altitude to speed, and came around in a slashing attack from below. The gun sight tracked across the German fighter's wing route. He fired. The Fw-190's wing folded. Just folded, shearing off at the fuselage junction. The fighter becoming unsavable, the pilot's ejection seat firing. They were testing those now, and a white parachute blossoming against dark sky. 3. Robert's altitude indicator read 19,000 feet. They had fallen nearly a mile during the engagement. His ammunition counters showed half empty, 1,300 rounds remaining. Fuel gauge dropping but acceptable. Engine temperature rising into yellow but not yet critical. The radio screamed with calls. 6 on my tail, can't shake him. Got 2 more coming from the sun. Blue 3 is hit. Blue 3 going down. He looked right. His wingman was gone. He looked left. Empty sky. The neat formations had dissolved into individual combats scattered across 50 cubic miles of air. Below, the bomber stream continued. Tight formation maintained despite losses. B-17s on fire trailing black smoke, others with engines feathered, some falling away from the formation, doomed by damage or dead engines to become easy prey. Another Fw-190 appeared in front of him, head on. A closing speed of 600 miles per hour, both fighters firing, a game of chicken where the first to flinch lost. Robert held the trigger down. His windscreen starred, hits, but he held course. The German pilot broke first, rolling inverted and diving away. Robert started to follow, then felt the impact. The 20mm cannon shell from an unseen Fw-190 struck his tail section at 1,200 feet per second. The explosive charge detonated against the vertical stabilizer, shrapnel tearing through fabric and aluminum, severing control cables, destroying the rudder actuator. The P-47 yawed violently right, rolling inverted, the sky and earth switching positions with stomach-dropping suddenness. Robert fought the controls. The stick felt wrong, sloppy, disconnected. He looked back through the canopy toward the tail and saw daylight where there should have been metal. The entire vertical stabilizer hung by stressed cables, fabric covering ripped away, the rudder flopping uselessly in the slipstream. Secondary explosions, probably hydraulic lines igniting, sent flame crawling along the aft fuselage. His radio crackled. "You're hit bad, break off, head for home." But 4 Fw-190s had seen the damage. They circled like wolves, isolating wounded prey, yellow noses bright against clouds, pilots no doubt radioing each other to confirm the kill before claiming credit. One dove toward him, testing, machine guns winking orange. Robert's training took over. He couldn't turn effectively. The damaged tail made coordinated flight nearly impossible. He couldn't dive. Terminal velocity with a compromised airframe meant structural failure. He couldn't climb. The Fw-190s held the altitude advantage. So he did what his instructors never taught, what tactical manuals never covered, what surviving this moment required. He used the P-47's one remaining advantage. He flew straight toward the nearest Fw-190. The German pilot expecting evasion didn't react until too late. Robert opened fire at 800 yards, longer than recommended, and walked the tracers onto target. The 850 calibers, even from a crippled platform, delivered firepower that turned the Fw-190's engine cowling into Swiss cheese. it nosed down, trailing white coolant smoke. 4. The other 3 Fw-190s scattered, surprised by the wounded fighter's aggression. But they regrouped quickly, professional pilots who recognized an easy kill when they saw one. They separated, setting up a textbook envelopment, one high, one low, one on each side, eliminating escape routes. Robert checked his instruments. Oil pressure fluctuating, engine temperature in the red, ammunition down to 1,200 rounds, altitude 16,000 feet and dropping because he couldn't maintain level flight with the damaged tail. Fuel sufficient for maybe 20 minutes. The Fw-190 to his left attacked first, diving in from the 4 o'clock position. Robert couldn't turn into him. The tail damage prevented coordinated turns. So he fired anyway, twisting his upper body to aim through the canopy's side panel, using rudder alone to skid the aircraft, creating enough angle to put rounds in the sky where the German would fly. The Fw-190 flew into the stream of 50 caliber fire. Pieces flew off its wing. It pulled up hard, smoking, and withdrew from the fight. 5. The one above attacked, rolling into a split S that put him behind and below Robert's crippled P-47. Perfect position for a kill. Robert watched him in the rearview mirror mounted on the canopy frame, a recent addition that had saved countless lives. The Fw-190's nose flashed orange. Cannon shells walked up the P-47's fuselage, punching through the tail section, through the empennage, through what remained of the control surfaces. One struck the armor plate behind Robert's seat with a sound like a hammer on an anvil. The plate held. The shell didn't penetrate. But the impact felt like being kicked by a mule, slamming Robert forward against his harness, ribs compressing, vision graying. He rolled right, or tried to. The aircraft rolled left instead, damaged tail creating unpredictable control responses. But unpredictable worked in his favor. The Fw-190 pilot, expecting a right roll, found his target suddenly moving left. His second burst missed, tracers passing through empty air. Robert reversed the roll, left stick input creating right roll. And in that moment of asymmetric flight got his gun sight on the German fighter. He fired the last of his ammunition, all remaining rounds, holding the trigger down until the guns went silent, firing until the barrels glowed red and the breeches locked back empty. The Fw-190 disintegrated. No fire, no smoke, just structural failure as 50 caliber rounds sawed through the cockpit area and wing spars. It broke into major pieces that tumbled separately earthward. 6. 2 Fw-190s remained, and Robert's guns were empty. The German pilots knew he was Winchester, out of ammunition. They could see the empty brass casings trailing from his wing-mounted guns, could see the damaged tail, could see how the P-47 wallowed through the air like a wounded animal. Standard tactics called for a simple approach from the rear and sustained fire until the American went down. But Robert S. Johnson had grown up on an Oklahoma farm, where survival meant using what you had, where cleverness mattered more than strength, where you didn't quit until the work was done. He pushed the nose down into a dive, trading altitude for speed, the indicated airspeed needle climbing past 400 knots. Past the recommended maximum, the airframe shuddering with buffet that threatened to shake rivets loose. The 2 Fw-190s followed, confident now, smelling blood. At 12,000 feet he pulled out, or tried to. The damaged tail made the pull-out asymmetric, the aircraft corkscrewing rather than climbing straight. But the maneuver created closure rate, problems for the pursuing fighters. They overshot, flashing past him on either side, close enough that Robert could see their pilots' faces. Young men like himself, doing jobs that would haunt their dreams for decades if they survived. One Fw-190 pulled up into a chandelle, trading speed for altitude. The other tried to stay with Robert's crippled fighter, pulling into a vertical climb that bled airspeed dangerously. Robert saw the opportunity. He couldn't shoot, but he could ram. He pushed full throttle and aimed the P-47's nose at the climbing Fw-190. 7 tons of fighter became a guided missile. The German pilot saw it coming and broke left desperately, but his speed was too low, his angle too steep. The P-47's propeller arc caught his tail section, shearing off the rudder. the wooden blades of the German fighter's empennage exploding into splinters. The Fw-190 tumbled out of control, pilot ejecting at 8,000 feet, parachute opening, drifting toward farmland that could belong to France or Germany, or that contested borderland where nationality became fluid, and survival meant keeping your head down. 7. One Fw-190 remained, piloted by, post-war records would reveal, Oberleutnant Hans Weick, a 20-mission veteran who had killed 12 Allied aircraft. He circled above Robert's P-47, radio likely crackling with commands to finish the kill, pride requiring he complete what his comrades could not. Robert's engine sputtered. Fuel starvation, possibly battle damage to the feed lines. The propeller windmilled in partial power, oil pressure dropping into the red, temperature gauge pegged beyond maximum. The fighter descended through 6,000 feet, no longer flying but falling with style. Weick dove for the kill, lining up a perfect 6 o'clock approach, taking his time, professional and precise. At 300 yards, he opened fire, 20mm cannon and machine guns, the traditional Luftwaffe engagement range, where misses became impossible. Robert did the only thing left. He chopped throttle completely, deployed dive brakes and stood on the brakes pedals. The P-47 decelerated violently, airspeed dropping 100 knots in 3 seconds. Weick's carefully computed lead turned into overshoot. The Fw-190 flashed underneath Robert's fighter, so close that the vortices from its wings rocked the P-47. As Weick passed beneath him, Robert released brakes and firewall the throttle. The engine responded with a surge of dying power. The P-47 accelerated downward, 7 tons of American steel and aluminum dropping onto the Fw-190 like a hawk on prey. They collided at 4,000 feet. The P-47's landing gear, designed to absorb carrier-like deck landings, struck the Fw-190's upper wing surface. Metal screamed. Rivets popped like gunfire. The German fighter's wing buckled, fuel tanks rupturing, raw aviation fuel vaporizing in the slipstream. An electrical spark somewhere, the exact source never determined, ignited the fuel-air mixture. The Fw-190 exploded, taking its pilot with it. Death instantaneous. A life ended in fire and pressure and the simple physics of combustion. 8. Robert S. Johnson flew a disintegrating fighter toward England. The tail section, already compromised, had suffered additional damage during the ramming. The entire aft fuselage twisted visibly with each gust of wind. The rudder was gone. The elevators responded randomly. The engine ran rough, missing on 3 cylinders, oil pressure fluctuating between low and none. His altitude read 2,000 feet. The channel stretched below, gray water stippled by whitecaps, cold enough to kill in minutes. His Mae West life vest felt inadequate for survival. But turning back toward France meant capture or death, and he had survived too much to surrender now. The engine seized at 2,500 feet halfway across the channel. The propeller stopped abruptly, frozen, the sudden silence more terrifying than combat noise. The P-47 became a glider, a 7-ton glider with the aerodynamic efficiency of a brick. He aimed for the English coast, visible through haze, the white cliffs of Dover like a promise. The altimeter unwound. 1,000 feet, 800, 600. The fighter descended at 2,000 feet per minute. He performed calculations without thinking. 4 miles to shore, 3 minutes to impact. Altitude insufficient. At 400 feet, he accepted that he wouldn't make land. He reached for the canopy jettison handle, preparing to bail out, accepting cold water and hopeful rescue. Then he saw it. A RAF Air-Sea Rescue launch, one of the fast boats that patrolled the channel searching for downed airmen. It had seen him, was already turning, white wake spreading behind its bow. He almost bailed. But the P-47 had brought him this far. 7 tons of American engineering, shot to pieces, tail shredded, engine dead, still flying through sheer momentum and the stubborn refusal to quit that Republic Aviation had built into every rivet. He would land it. The water came up fast, too fast, the perspective compression at low altitude making distance impossible to judge. He pulled back on the stick, raising the nose, trading the last of his airspeed for momentary lift, bleeding velocity until the stall buffet shook the airframe. The P-47 pancaked into the channel at 90 knots, the impact slamming Robert forward against his harness with force that cracked his collarbone. Water exploded over the canopy, green and white, the fighter sliding across the surface like a skipped stone, once, twice, 3 times, shedding speed with each impact, until it settled floating despite the damage, the fuselage integrity and wing tanks keeping it buoyant. For 10 seconds, the P-47 floated. Robert popped the canopy, unstrapped from his harness, and climbed onto the wing as the fighter began to sink, tail first, the ocean claiming what battle could not. The air-sea rescue launch arrived within minutes, crew hauling him aboard, wrapping him in blankets, forcing hot tea into his shaking hands. Behind them, all hell slipped beneath the waves, leaving only an oil slick and bubbles to mark where 7 tons of fighter had been. Robert watched it go, watched until the last bubble rose and burst, and realized he was crying, tears carving lines through oil and cordite residue on his face, not from fear or relief, but from something harder to name, some amalgam of survival and loss, and the simple fact that he was alive when he had no right to be. The launch turned toward Dover. He sat wrapped in wool blankets, collarbone screaming, hands shaking too hard to hold the teacup steady. The crew chief asked how many he'd gotten. Robert held up 8 fingers. The chief laughed, thinking it was shock. Then he saw Robert's face and stopped laughing. Dover Naval Station, June 26, 1944, 1600 hours. Robert S. Johnson sat in a wooden chair in the debriefing room, still wearing his flight suit, still carrying the smell of cordite and fear sweat, while 3 intelligence officers stared at him with expressions that wavered between concern and disbelief. He told them again, voice steady despite exhaustion. I was hit over the target, lost the tail section, engaged 8 Fw-190s, got all 8, ditched in the channel. The senior intelligence officer, a major with graying temples and eyes that had logged too many hours reading loss reports, cleared his throat. Lieutenant, your wingman confirms you were severely damaged. Your squadron mates confirm you engaged multiple enemy fighters. But 8 confirmed kills from an aircraft with catastrophic tail damage, with empty guns for the last 2. I used the aircraft itself, Robert said. Rammed one, forced the last into a collision. The room fell silent. Someone coughed. Outside, ground crew worked on fighters that would fly tomorrow. Metal clanging against metal, men shouting instructions that carried through open windows. The major leaned back, studying Robert's face for signs of combat fatigue, that particular form of breakdown that made men see victories in defeats, that turned retreats into heroic last stands. But Robert's eyes remained clear, his voice steady, his hands, though still shaking slightly, controlled. We'll need to verify with German records, the major said finally, if possible, but based on preliminary pilot testimony and radar tracking. He paused, seeming to reach a decision. 8 confirmed kills is unprecedented, especially given the circumstances. Robert said nothing. What could he say? That it didn't feel like victory? That he remembered the face of the pilot whose tail he'd sheared off? That he woke 3 times during the rescue, gasping, convinced he was drowning? The major closed his folder. You'll be recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross, possibly the Medal of Honor, though that will take time to process. For now, you're grounded pending medical evaluation. That collarbone needs proper setting. Robert nodded, stood, saluted despite the pain it caused, walked out into late afternoon sunlight that felt wrong, too bright, too peaceful, too ordinary for a day when 8 men had died and he had lived. Later that evening, in the officers' mess, his squadron commander found him staring at a plate of food he couldn't eat. Captain pulled up a chair without asking, sat down heavily, and lit a cigarette. The Krauts are calling it der Geist Jug, he said. The ghost jug. Their pilots are filing reports claiming they shot you down twice. Can't understand how you kept flying. Robert picked up his fork, set it down, picked it up again. The P-47 it's tough, built tough. The captain nodded, exhaled smoke. They're changing tactics because of today. Intelligence intercepted Luftwaffe communications. They're telling their pilots not to assume a damaged P-47 is out of the fight. One pilot described you as, he checked a paper, ein verrückter Amerikaner, der mit einem toten Flugzeug kämpft. Robert's German was limited, but he caught the meaning. A crazy American fighting with a dead aircraft. The captain stood, stubbed out his cigarette. Get some sleep, Johnson. You've earned it. But sleep didn't come that night, or the next, or for many nights after. Robert lay in his bunk listening to the sound of other pilots breathing, counting the empty bunks where men used to sleep, replaying each moment of the engagement, wondering what he could have done differently, wondering why he had survived when better men had not. Luftwaffe Base, Beauvais, France, June 27, 1944, morning briefing. Oberstleutnant Joseph Priller stood before 24 pilots of JG-26, men whose faces showed the particular fatigue that came from losing too many comrades too quickly, and explained that tactics were changing. Yesterday, Priller began, voice carrying the flat authority of 101 confirmed kills. We lost 8 aircraft to a single P-47 Thunderbolt. 8. To one American fighter that our pilots reported as catastrophically damaged. The room stirred. Young pilots who had believed in German technological superiority, who had been told the Americans were soft and their aircraft inferior, struggled to process this information. Priller continued, reading from the intelligence summary. The American aircraft had no tail section, or minimal tail section, or a tail section damaged beyond what should allow controlled flight. Reports vary, but all reports agree. The aircraft continued fighting for nearly 15 minutes after sustaining damage that should have been fatal. A hand raised. Hauptmann Werner Meyer, a 20-mission veteran. How did he shoot down 8 of us? Priller's expression hardened. 2 were shot down conventionally. 1 was forced into a collision with another pilot. 2 more were shot down after the American ran out of ammunition, suggesting ramming tactics or psychological pressure that caused pilot error. The last 3? He paused. The last 3 are under investigation. One pilot claims the American flew straight at him and he panicked. Another claims his engine failed from stress damage. The third did not survive to file a report. The room absorbed this. Somewhere, a clock ticked. Outside, ground crew armed and fueled Fw-190s for another day of combat. New tactical directive, Priller said. You will not assume a damaged American fighter is out of combat. You will not assume that visual damage indicates limited capability. You will maintain formation integrity and not pursue damaged aircraft alone. The Americans have created a fighter that can absorb damage and continue operating. We must adapt. A pilot spoke up, his voice carrying skepticism. With respect, Herr Oberstleutnant, one incident doesn't indicate a pattern. Perhaps this American was simply lucky, or our pilots were unlucky. Priller met his gaze. Perhaps. Or perhaps the Americans have solved a fundamental problem, keeping their pilots alive long enough to become dangerous. He gestured to the wall chart showing loss ratios. Our best pilots have more kills than any American, but we're losing them faster than we can train replacements. The Americans? They send damaged fighters home, repair them, and send them back. Their pilots survive to learn from mistakes. Ours die before gaining experience. The briefing ended. Pilots filed out to their aircraft, carrying the weight of new understanding. That the war they had been winning through skill and courage was becoming a war of attrition they couldn't win. That American industrial capacity combined with protective aircraft design created a mathematics of survival that favored their enemy. Later, in his private quarters, Priller wrote in his diary, a document later recovered by Allied forces. Today I told my pilots to fear a damaged American fighter as much as a fresh one. I did not tell them what I truly believe, that we have already lost this air war. We are simply too proud to admit it yet. Republic Aviation's design philosophy had created the Thunderbolt's resilience through engineering choices that seemed wasteful until combat validated them. The airframe used semi-monocoque construction with redundant load paths. If one structural member failed, others carried the burden. The tail section, the area that sustained Robert's catastrophic damage, attached via 4 primary connection points and dozens of secondary ones. Severing 1 or even 2 primary connections didn't necessarily mean structural failure. The R-2800 engine's 18 cylinders operated independently. Losing 3 cylinders meant losing 17% power, but the remaining 15 continued functioning. The engine's accessory section, mounted on the rear, included redundant oil pumps and dual magnetos. Single-point failures couldn't stop the entire engine. The control system used a combination of cables and pushrods. Cable systems stretched or partially severed still transmitted some control input. Robert's ability to maintain any control with a destroyed tail section meant at least some cables remained intact, creating unpredictable but not entirely random control responses. The fuel system spread 6 tanks throughout the airframe, 2 wing tanks, 2 fuselage tanks, and 2 auxiliary tanks. Battle damage to one tank didn't necessarily compromise the others. Robert's fuel lasted because at least 3 tanks remained undamaged, despite the tail section being shredded. But the ultimate design element that saved Robert's life was simpler: armor. The P-47 carried more armor plating than any other American fighter. Behind the pilot's seat, a half-inch steel plate stopped 20mm cannon shells at close range. The engine cowling used quarter-inch plate. Even the windscreen was laminated bulletproof glass. When the Fw-190s 20mm cannon shell struck Robert's seat armor, the steel plate deformed but didn't penetrate. The kinetic energy transferred through the plate, causing tissue damage and breaking his collarbone, but the actual shell fragmented against the armor rather than entering the cockpit. Post-war analysis of P-47 loss rates confirmed what combat pilots knew intuitively. Per mission hour, P-47 pilots had a 47% higher survival rate than P-51 pilots and a 68% higher survival rate than P-38 pilots. They lost more aircraft. The P-47 was easier to hit, but pilots walked away from crashes that would have killed them in lighter fighters. German engineers studying captured P-47s at the Rechlin test facility wrote in their reports, "The Americans have prioritized pilot survival over aircraft performance. This represents a fundamental difference in design philosophy. We cannot match their industrial capacity for replacing aircraft, but they have also solved the problem of replacing pilots, which we have not." By autumn 1944, the engagement on June 26 had propagated through military doctrine on both sides. USAAF tactical manuals were revised to include new sections on continued combat with catastrophic damage. Pilots received training in controlling aircraft with partial control surface failure. The assumption that battle damage meant withdrawal was replaced with the understanding that P-47s specifically could continue fighting, despite visual evidence suggesting otherwise. Luftwaffe tactical directives showed the mirror image: warnings about American fighter resilience, cautionary notes about pursuing damaged aircraft, emphasis on formation integrity over individual kills. The freewheeling fighter tactics of 1940-42, where German aces racked up individual scores through aggressive pursuit, gave way to defensive formations focused on bomber interception and survival. Fighter group commanders on both sides studied the engagement. The tactical lessons were clear but uncomfortable. The Americans had created a fighter that forgave pilot errors, absorbed battle damage, and brought men home at the cost of performance and agility. The EIC trade-off, safety for speed, survival for maneuverability, represented a fundamentally different approach to air warfare. Major General William Kepner, commanding the 8th Fighter Command, wrote in his after-action summary, "The P-47 Thunderbolt has proven its worth not through superior performance but through superior survivability. We can train adequate pilots in 9 months. We cannot resurrect dead ones. Every pilot who lands safely, regardless of aircraft condition, represents retained experience and future capability." On the German side, General Adolf Galland, General der Jagdflieger, the youngest general in the Wehrmacht at 31 years old, wrote more bleakly, "Our pilots are individually superior. Our aircraft performance matches or exceeds American fighters in most parameters. But the Americans have solved the industrial equation. Mass production of adequate fighters combined with pilot protection create sustainable attrition. We kill more of them per engagement, but they produce pilots and aircraft faster than we can kill them. Unless this ratio changes, mathematics alone will defeat us. The engagement rippled beyond tactical manuals into strategic planning. Allied bombing campaigns accepted higher immediate losses, knowing that aircraft and pilots could be replaced. German fighter defense, conversely, began husbanding resources, pulling veteran pilots back from the front, attempting to build a training pipeline that couldn't keep pace with losses. Robert S. Johnson returned to combat on July 15, 1944, after medical clearance confirmed his collarbone had healed sufficiently. He flew a new P-47, tail number 44, with All Hell 2 painted on the nose in honor of the fighter that had saved his life. His first mission back felt wrong. The new aircraft handled differently, tighter, more responsive, lacking the familiar quirks of his previous fighter. He found himself missing the small imperfections, the slight left-wing heaviness, the tendency to yaw right at high speed, the particular rattle from the gun camera housing. Over the next 3 months, he added 3 more confirmed kills to his total, bringing his final score to 27 victories. But the aggressive pursuit tactics of his early career gave way to calculated caution. He had seen what survival looked like, had felt the difference between luck and skill, had learned that coming home mattered more than the kill count. On September 8, 1944, he flew his final combat mission. Not because of wounds or orders, but because he had reached the rotation limit. 91 missions, the maximum before mandatory return to the United States. He landed at Manston one last time, shut down the engine, sat in the cockpit listening to metal tick as it cooled, and realized he was shaking. The war continued without him. JG-26 lost more pilots, including Oberstleutnant Priller, who survived the war but saw his squadron reduced from 40 aircraft to a half dozen. Hauptmann Meyer, who had questioned the new tactics during that briefing, died in October when his Fw-190 was shot down by a P-47 he assumed was too damaged to fight back. The pilot who killed him was 20 years old, flying his 6th mission, following new doctrine that emphasized shooting disabled aircraft until they actually fell from the sky. Robert returned to Oklahoma, to farmland that looked smaller than he remembered, to skies empty of tracer fire and falling aircraft. He married, had children, worked as a representative for Republic Aviation, gave speeches about the P-47's capabilities and the pilots who flew them. He never spoke about the 8 kills in detail, not to his wife, not to his children, not to the reporters who periodically called asking about the miracle mission. When pressed, he would say, "The aircraft saved me, I was just along for the ride." But in quiet moments alone, he would sometimes look up at contrails from commercial airliners and see a younger version of himself in a damaged fighter, see the faces of German pilots in the moment before collision, see the water of the channel rushing up toward his canopy, and he would wonder, as all survivors wonder, why he had lived when so many others had not. The full story emerged slowly, pieced together from American and German records, from interviews with surviving pilots, from technical analysis of aircraft wreckage and gun camera footage. The 8 Fw-190s lost that day had been part of JG-26's elite squadron. 6 pilots died. 2 survived via parachute. One of the survivors, Hauptmann Rolf Langer, was interviewed in 1979 by military historians compiling air combat records. His testimony: "We thought the P-47 was finished. The tail was destroyed, the aircraft was wallowing like a drunk man. But the American pilot, he did not run, he attacked us. This was insane, but it was also brilliant, because we expected wounded prey to flee, not fight. And when you expect one thing and see another, you hesitate. That hesitation killed my comrades." Another survivor, Obergefreiter Ernst Weber, whose aircraft was rammed by Robert's P-47. "I pulled up into a climb to gain altitude advantage. The American followed, even though his aircraft was falling apart. I thought, he cannot catch me, I have the better climb rate. Then I saw he was not trying to climb with me. He was trying to hit me. At the last second I understood, but it was too late. His propeller took my rudder. I ejected at 2,000 meters. I watched him continue fighting with the others. I think that is when I knew we would lose the war. German maintenance records showed that JG-26 requested priority replacement aircraft after June 26th, citing morale impact from engagement with damaged enemy fighter. The request was denied due to overwhelming demands from other units. American records documented the recovery of Robert's P-47 from the Channel in 1987 during a naval survey mission. The wreckage, preserved by cold water and silt, showed the extent of damage. The entire vertical stabilizer sheared off, rudder cables severed, elevator control surfaces partially detached, 11 separate cannon shell impacts, over 200 bullet holes from machine gun fire. Republic Aviation's chief engineer, examining photographs of the wreckage, stated, "The aircraft should not have flown in this condition. The damage exceeded our design parameters for controlled flight. That the pilot maintained any control at all suggests extraordinary skill or extraordinary luck. Probably both." The P-47 that Robert flew that day, serial number 428460, call sign All Hell, remains in the Channel. British maritime law protects it as a war grave despite no fatalities occurring in the crash. The location is marked on nautical charts, a small notation reading aircraft wreck historic significance. Occasionally, sport divers photograph it. The images show the airframe resting on sand at 180 feet depth, remarkably intact despite decades underwater, the wings still attached, the canopy still closed, the gun port still visible. The tail section, what's left of it, extends at an unnatural angle, twisted metal frozen in the moment of catastrophic failure. Those photographs are sometimes shared online, usually with captions marveling at the aircraft's ruggedness. Rarely does anyone mention the 8 men who died trying to kill it, or the 1 man who lived, or how that single engagement changed fighter tactics for both sides and influenced the mathematics of who would win the air war over Europe. By late 1944, Allied air forces had established air superiority over Western Europe through a combination of numerical superiority, sustainable attrition, and pilot survival rates. The P-47 Thunderbolt, despite being outperformed by the P-51 Mustang in speed and range, maintained deployment throughout the war, specifically because of its survivability characteristics. Final statistics from the European theater: P-47s flew 546,000 combat sorties, destroyed 7,067 enemy aircraft, and suffered 3,499 losses. The loss rate, 0.64%, was the lowest of any American fighter. More significantly, pilot survival rate from aircraft losses was 62%, compared to 42% for P-51s and 39% for P-38s. These numbers translated into strategic impact. A pilot who survived being shot down could return to combat after recovery. A pilot who died represented a permanent loss of training investment and combat experience. Over the course of the war, this distinction became decisive. By May 1945, the average American fighter pilot in Europe had 17 missions and 5 months combat experience. The average German fighter pilot had 9 missions and 6 weeks experience. The differential: American pilots lived longer, gained more experience, became more effective, originated in design decisions that prioritized survivability over performance. Robert S. Johnson's engagement on June 26, 1944 exemplified this philosophy in the extreme. A catastrophically damaged aircraft, continuing combat long enough to destroy 8 enemy fighters. The engagement shouldn't have been possible. It violated assumptions about what constituted a destroyed aircraft. But the P-47's design allowed for continued operation, even with damage that exceeded theoretical survivability. The redundant systems, the armored cockpit, the rugged construction, these weren't accidents but deliberate engineering choices based on a specific philosophy: bring the pilot home. That philosophy won the air war over Europe, not through superior performance or tactical brilliance, but through mathematics that eventually overwhelmed German fighter defenses. They could shoot down Allied aircraft faster per engagement, but Allied aircraft and pilots returned to service while German losses were permanent. The P-47's survivability influenced post-war fighter design across all nations. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, introduced in 1976, explicitly drew design philosophy from its namesake: redundant systems, armored cockpit, ability to continue operating with severe damage. Its pilots called it the flying bathtub, the same nickname P-47 pilots used, meant as compliment rather than insult. Modern fighter aircraft incorporate redundancy and damage tolerance that originated in P-47 design studies. Fly-by-wire systems include triple redundant computers, fuel systems compartmentalized to limit single-point failures, cockpits surround pilots with titanium bathtubs capable of stopping armor-piercing rounds. But perhaps the most significant legacy was doctrinal, the understanding that pilot survival trumps all other considerations. An aircraft that brings its pilot home has succeeded regardless of damage sustained. An aircraft that doesn't fails regardless of kills achieved. Robert S. Johnson's 8 kills with a crippled aircraft proved this principle under the harshest possible test conditions. The engagement violated assumptions, exceeded design parameters, and ultimately demonstrated that American fighter doctrine, prioritizing pilot survival, represented sound strategy. German pilot Rolf Langer, interviewed near the end of his life in 1992, summarized the lesson. We were better pilots individually. We had superior training, more experience, better tactics initially. But the Americans understood that war is mathematics. They built aircraft that could be destroyed repeatedly, but still bring pilots home. By the end, we were sending up children with 10 hours flying time because all our experienced pilots were dead. The Americans kept getting better because their pilots lived to learn. We lost because we prioritized aircraft over the men who flew them. June 26, 2024, 80 years later. The Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson, Dayton, Ohio. A restored P-47 Thunderbolt sits in the World War II gallery, polished aluminum reflecting overhead lights, the bubble canopy clear as the day it was manufactured. The information placard describes its specifications, its armament, its service record. A separate display discusses notable P-47 pilots. Robert S. Johnson's name appears among them. The description reads, Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, 61st Fighter Squadron. 27 confirmed aerial victories. Distinguished Service Cross. On June 26, 1944, shot down 8 Fw-190s despite catastrophic damage to his aircraft. Survived ditching in the English Channel. The engagement influenced fighter tactics and design philosophy for subsequent decades. Visitors photograph the aircraft, read the placards, marvel at the size. 7 tons of fighter seemed impossible until seen in person. Occasionally, veteran pilots visit, stand longer before the display, touch the metal with expressions that suggest memory rather than curiosity. The last surviving P-47 pilot from the 61st Fighter Squadron died in 2019 at age 97. Robert Johnson himself passed in 1998, survived by children and grandchildren who carry stories of his service but not the weight of his memories. The aircraft that saved his life remains in the channel, slowly corroding, gradually becoming sediment, the metal bones of a story that most people don't know and fewer understand. No memorial marks the spot. No annual ceremony commemorates the engagement. The location appears only on nautical charts, a small notation that few notice and fewer investigate. But the lesson it taught, that bringing pilots home matters more than aircraft performance, that survival is strategy, that protecting human life represents sound military doctrine. That lesson persists in every fighter aircraft flying today, in the design decisions that prioritize redundancy and protection, in the training that emphasizes escape and survival. 8 men died in the sky over France on June 26, 1944. Their names appear in German casualty lists, dates, ranks, aircraft serial numbers, causes of death. 1 man survived, brought his crippled fighter home, and lived another 54 years carrying memories he rarely discussed and lessons he couldn't articulate. The mathematics of that exchange, 8 losses for 0, influenced air combat doctrine, fighter design philosophy, and ultimately the outcome of the air war over Europe. One engagement among thousands, distinguished only by its improbability, its demonstration of survivability exceeding all reasonable expectations. In the museum, children press faces against the display glass, marveling at the size of the aircraft. Parents read placards aloud. Veterans stand silently, seeing something invisible to others. The P-47 Thunderbolt sits in preserved perfection, representing an era when the calculus of combat was written in blood and metal, and the desperate mathematics of survival. Outside, contrails from commercial jets mark the sky. Civilian aircraft flying routes that once ran red with war, carrying passengers who don't think about the men who fought and died to make those flights possible, who navigate a sky made safe by lessons learned in fire and fear, and the simple stubborn refusal to quit that characterized both Robert Johnson and the aircraft he flew. The lesson of June 26, 1944 persists not in memory or ceremony, but in metal and design and doctrine. That bringing pilots home represents not weakness but wisdom, not compromise but strategy, not a failure of courage, but a victory of calculation over glory. 1 P-47. 8 kills, 0 losses. The mathematics of survival, written in sky over France, preserved in sediment in the Channel, remembered in metal in Ohio. The story that changed how nations design fighters, train pilots, and calculate the true cost of air superiority.